Well, thank you. Thank you. I haven't seen this many people at Chatham House in a very long time. We're delighted to have all of you here for today's event on #MeToo. My name is Shireen El-Feki. I'm the chair of today's session. I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House. My work specializes on sexuality and masculinities. I've been described in the media as a sexpert, which I think is a great term. And I have to tell you, was not a career option that my high school guidance counselor ever gave me. In this session, as I said, we're looking at #MeToo, what a difference a year makes or not, as the case may be. And these are the issues we're going to unpack. Clearly, it's a very complex and sensitive subject, and it crosses into so many domains, into politics and media and culture and society. It's the political, it's the personal. And to help us explore these issues, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a wonderful panel of guests. Let me introduce them in turn. Beside me, Shaista Aziz. Shaista is a former BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera journalist. Now, Shaista, you're still commenting in the media?
Yes.
And then you've also taken it offline, and you're an activist.
Yeah.
And you started the Everyday Bigotry Project. And also, now tell me, the Intersectional...
Feminist Foreign Policy.
Fantastic. And you are also a newly elected member of Oxford City Council.
I am, yes.
Yes, so a woman with a lot of time on her hands. Continuing that trend is Helena Kennedy. Helena is one of the UK's leading human rights lawyers. She is a member of the House of Lords. She's a former principal of Mansfield College in Oxford, and she's the author of several books on women and the justice system, and more on that a bit later. Beside her is Heidi Sophia Mirza. Heidi is an emeritus professor of equality studies at UCL. Is that correct, Heidi? And you're currently a visiting professor of race, faith, and culture. You know, none of the hot topics for you there, at Goldsmiths. And your teaching and writing, which includes also several books, right, focuses on race, gender, and identity in educational systems. And at the end of the panel, our man for the panel, the man on the panel, is Dan Guinness. Now, Dan is the director of the Good Lad Initiative. This is a really interesting NGO that works with men and boys across the UK to engage them on gender equality, to challenge harmful stereotypes, gender norms, and practices. So, just as we start, a word about the format of this session. As I've said, this is a really complex topic, and so we're only going to be able to scratch the surface, I'm afraid. So we're going to hone in on certain key points in panel discussion. We're going to hear from each of our speakers, and then we're going to open the floor to your questions and comments. Now, just a word about language. For ease of communication, we're going to talk about men and women, boys and girls, but we are fully inclusive here of LGBTQ, and we're not into binaries, not at all, on this panel. The no binaries also applies to your phones. So this is not a question of on-off. It's a question of please put your phones on silent so we can promote a free and frank exchange of views. But please feel free to post using the #CHEvents. Talking about social media, this event is being live streamed. And I'm going to take a moment to give a shout out to Nick Cressy, who is the head of members events. Nick was the driving force behind this panel. Nick is not with us today because he's doing something more productive, or rather reproductive. He is attending the birth of his first child, a son. So hey there, Nick. We're looking forward to seeing your son at next year's event. So before we go any further on #MeToo, I'm going to do a little bit of #WeToo. Okay? And I'm going to turn to all of us here on the panel, and just a really simple question to set the frame. Raise your hand if you have ever experienced sexual harassment or gender-based violence. Yeah. Okay, so we come from very different backgrounds. We're working in very different sectors, but this is an all too common experience, and I'm sure it's the same for you in the audience as well. And what we really want to do in this session is to move beyond just the consideration of #MeToo, because the sexual violence that it addresses is really just a symptom of a much bigger malady, and that malady goes beyond even gender inequalities to other forms of inequality. So what we really want to do in this session is to dig a bit deeper and to understand the root cause of this, which is the use and abuse of power. And more particularly, we want to start exploring remedies, which is how do we bring accountability into our political and personal lives. So with that setting of the stage, I'm going to turn to Shaista first, because Shaista, as a journalist, but also as an activist, you have been on the pointy end of the hashtag, pushing it forward for accountability. So when you look now at a year of activity, what would you say from your own personal perspective have been the major successes, but also the significant setbacks?
Okay, well, it's really great to be here, so thank you very much for the invite. And also, before I start, I just want to acknowledge that there will be people in the room for who some of this conversation will be triggering, and it may bring back, you know, some memories of things that have happened and what people have experienced. So I just want to acknowledge that when I start. And so I think, well, first of all, Me Too it's not new. It's been around for more than 10 years. It was set up as a movement by a black woman, a sociologist by the name of Tarana Burke, and she set it up specifically to discuss the issues that were impacting women of color in the USA and women, working class women. So I think it's really important to start from there. Now, in the past year, what's happened is the Me Too has been reinvented and it's been put back out there in the public domain. And it started off with Hollywood actresses, as we know, but it's definitely morphed and it's taken a life of its own. And I think what it's basically done is it's offered a platform and an opportunity for people, particularly women, to talk about sexual harassment, sexual exploitation and abuse. And it's also offered a platform for solidarity. These are very difficult issues and conversations for people to have. And I think what it's done is opened up space. And to open up space itself is a very political act. Silencing victims, in particular women, is also a very political act. So Me Too is far from perfect. However, it is something that I think is definitely here. It's not going away. It will only grow. So this year alone, we've seen Me Too in India, for example. It's really kicked off in India in the past 2 months. We've seen a Me Too movement in China. We've seen it in Brazil. And most, I think, powerfully perhaps of all, in the USA, we've seen the first industrial action being taken by McDonald's workers, by women, who have described the sexual harassment that they've been facing at work. And there was actually the first ever strike under the Me Too movement. And I raise that here because at the heart of this is power and patriarchy and abuse of power, but also race and class is absolutely key to this movement. And men and toxic masculinity, and you know, men are victims of this abuse as much as women are as well. And I think all of this is now coming together. So I myself have been involved quite heavily in Me Too through the aid lens. So I was an aid worker for more than 10 years, and one of my friends and sisters, Alexia, is in the audience here. We set up a platform called NGO Safe Space to basically assist victims and survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment in the aid sector. So we've spent the last 7-8 months working on that, and what we've managed to do is we've managed to build up a lot of trust with people, which is essential to this work, and we have opened up space. We're very proud of that fact. We're pushing to open up more space, because when people are made invisible, it's done on purpose, it's done deliberately, it's not done accidentally. Erasure is a term that's used to describe, you know, removing people's voices and their realities and their stories. And what we need to do is we need to put people's realities and their stories at the center of this. And so this is the type of work that we've been doing.
Many thanks for setting the scene for us, Shaista. Helen, I want to turn to you because, again, among the many hats you wear is that of a legislator. And certainly in the early days of the hashtag #MeToo wave, there was a hope that political cultures would change. Some significant prominent heads did roll. There have been hard-hitting reports on sexual harassment and bullying in the UK Parliament, for instance. But more recently, we've also seen the pendulum swing back again, whether it's the Kavanaugh hearing. For those of you who are not familiar, this is the Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh in the U.S., who was confirmed in the context of some really very moving testimony from one of his alleged victims, Christine Blasey Ford, of sexual assault on his part. But clearly he was confirmed. And of course, just over the weekend, we saw in Brazil Jair Bolsonaro, arch misogynist and homophobe in chief, elected as the new president of Brazil. So from where you stand, Helena, do you see, I mean, how is it going to be possible to change cultures of sex and power in politics?
Well, there's a big question. I've been, as you can all see, I'm probably old enough to be the mother of most of you in this audience. And I've been a practitioner lawyer for over 40 years. And I've written and perhaps started writing about the whole business of how, for example, justice systems fail women. I've been writing about that most of my professional life. I started as a young lawyer. I was working in the courts, and I was a young feminist in the 70s. And I started through the prism of being a young woman from a working class background, concerned that law should deliver for everybody, to see the ways in which it failed whole sections of our society. And it failed working class men, it failed black people, it failed women. But I chose to write about the women issue because it was really so powerfully present in the cases that I was doing at the time. And so by the time I became a Queen's Counsel in 1991, I wrote a book about it. It was called Eve Was Framed, and I've just rewritten this 27 years afterwards as Eve Was Shamed. And I was looking again, and I was really, if you like, influenced by the fact of Me Too, to say that Me Too, in many ways, is a response to law's failure. It's a response to the failure of our legal systems to deliver justice for women. And it's not just women that are failed by law. There are other sections of our community who are failed by law too. And then if you multiply it, and you are, so it happens for gay men, for working class men, but it happens also particularly if you have multiple ways of being discriminated against as a woman who might be black and who might be working class and whatever. Your sexuality might come into play too. So multiplying disadvantage, of course, multiplies, injustice. So what I feel about Me Too is that Me Too is actually a big brick being thrown through the establishment's windows. It is a form of civil disobedience. Just like the suffragettes did back in the beginning of the 20th century, and they started saying, you're not listening to us, you're not prepared to have us in your legislature, you're not prepared to have us as lawyers and judges and so on. Well, we are going to make sure that you are not silencing us and that we're going to be heard one way or another. And so that is what many women, using a platform of sharing experience, but also naming and shaming men who have made their lives a misery, actually by sexually abusing, by raping, by assaulting, by sexually harassing in the workplace and so on. And most of the time, exactly as we've heard, this is about power, and it's about an abuse of power. And of course, it's right that at times men also experience that kind of abuse of power, and I'm sure Dan will talk about it. But it's very largely, particularly in the sexual content of some of this stuff, it's women who more or less carry the burden of it. But the burden is about very, if you like, rigid ideas about what is female, what is male, what the expectations of men should be, and the sense of entitlement about lots of the things that they feel should be happening. I feel that this is an important moment that should be seized, and there is a backlash, and the backlash is that there are women of my age who are saying, oh, for heaven's sake, it's gone too far. There are going to be men who are going to be unfairly named and shamed, and that's true. Because when people start going for wild justice, that's what happens. But if the justice system has not been delivering justice for women for decades and hundreds of years, then that's what you get. And so it's a call out, I think, not just for the legal system, but also for Parliament and the makers of law to say, you are failing in delivering the kind of justice that there ought to be in our societies. And it's being felt across the board, because I've been in India too recently, I've been to other parts of Europe, and everywhere I go, women are saying, we've remained silent for too long about this stuff. We've not been listened to. And I'll give you an example of this. This is not new. This is not Hollywood. Think of Rotherham. Think of all those cities where we've seen the grooming of girls and then to pass them around for sexual purposes. Think of Jimmy Savile and the scandals of people who got away with sexual abuse for years because they were powerful people, or they were celebrities, or they were bringing in money for charities, or whatever it was. Think about children's homes and the abuse in children's homes, in schools, in musical academies, in universities. Think about the scandals and indeed the questions about Parliament just now. And this is endemic. And the time has come for us to say this isn't good enough. And it's not just a burden on the lives of women, and we've talked about this isn't just binary. It's a burden on men in an expectation of certain kinds of masculinity, which actually is toxic for men too. And remember the men who came forward and talked about how they were abused when they were wanting to become footballers and they were 13 and 14 and coaches took advantage of them. And then they, as adult men, spoke about how it had poisoned their lives and their emotional relationships and how they hadn't ever been able to talk about it because they felt shame too. And the way in which we share shame over all this stuff. And the time has come for us to say, this is not good enough. We have to have a better way of living together in society. But I do want to just tell you, I spoke at something recently, and I said, I was talking about this. This is about creating equality in our society. Hard to do it when there's such, if you like, financial inequality too, to add to this mix. But a man in the audience put his hand up and he said, oh, this business of equality. He said, what's going to happen to us when you get equality, when you women get equality? And you're supposed to laugh at that, you know, because the point about it is that he felt a sense of loss, that somehow giving equality to women, to gay men, to, you know, creating a more equal society, it was going to mean loss for him. And we have to say, that isn't what it means. That actually creating a society in which is more equal is actually a gain for everybody. And that's what we have to be talking about. Thank you.
No, absolutely, Helen. I mean, the idea that it's somehow a zero-sum game. It's very interesting. So a lot of my work focuses on engaging with men on gender equality, like the work that Dan does in various parts of the world. And one of the things we find looking at tens of thousands of men and women around the world is that actually men do benefit. Although men are very resistant, can be resistant to losing the sense of privilege and power. Actually, men who, for example, are more engaged in the home, are helping their partners with the nitty-gritty of childcare, not only is it good for their kids and good for their partners, but it's also good for them as well in terms of their psychological well-being and even their physical health. And as one leading sociologist of masculinities has pointed out as well, it actually leads to more sex as well. It's a better sex life. Better sex life. So, you know, as we need
means better sex. That's
well, you know, it's actually ironing as a form of foreplay, really. But again, it's making that argument, which can be tricky. And for that, I'm going to turn to you, Dan, now to pick up on this point. I'm going to quote one of the eminent thinkers of our day. President Trump, who, with his trademark eloquence, and sadly I'm no Trevor Noah here, I won't try and do the accent, it has been a very scary time for young men in America when you can be guilty of something that you may not be guilty of.
And for old men.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I'm going to translate that into English. So it's really a question of men feeling on the defensive, right? Through #MeToo and these questions for greater gender equality. So how do you, as a man, but also as a man who works with men from different backgrounds and different ages, how do you respond to that sort of defensive framing? And what sort of responses are you seeing from the ground over the past year from the men you've been working with?
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm very privileged to be on this panel here and to already get that background. The last week I've been on the radio and all over the country, and every single time that it comes to me, which is normally about this point, like 45 minutes into the hour, the conversation has somehow shifted from a report about sexual harassment to a conversation of like, oh, but women also do this. Like, men also struggle with these problems, rather than focusing on actually what was being discussed in the first place. And I've got to say, when Me Too first came into my world, not when it first started, but first it came into my world about a year ago, it was via the social media, my Facebook feed primarily, where friend after friend, family members, my auntie, posted messages just talking about their experiences. And I work in this, I shouldn't have been shocked in a way, but I was. And I had all sorts of reactions. Partly I reflected on my own experiences. And I had those feelings of fear and of shame and of guilt. I had worries. I was like, have I behaved in these ways? And when will people come to call me out in that? And there was a confrontation that I experienced with this unseen, unwanted truth that had always been there, but that I'd ignored. And I was having these experiences in South Africa, and we're at a school and we're running the most insanely intense week of workshops. It was something like 18 workshops with boys between the age of 15 and 18. And they hadn't heard of Me Too, hadn't arrived to them yet. But they were having the same reactions to the stories from their female classmates and the experiences of their female classmates that we were showing to them. And we would convey some stats about just the feeling of being unsafe and of having had some negative experiences of harassment. And the most prevalent first reaction was shock and then defense. It was, no, that's exaggeration. They always do this. They say stuff that isn't true. Or it's not me, it's the other guys. I'm not part of it. And that reaction, I think, is completely understandable and very normal. Because and we see this rippling through society where people were living their lives thinking that they were being good members of a safe community, a positive community, and then suddenly through Me Too, that can no longer be true, or you have to deny it. And so I think this is part of the fear that people like Trump tap into. But it's also part of the opportunity that we have. And we have an opportunity not just for justice, which is crucial, but also we have an opportunity for changing cultures, for building better communities, and for transforming gender norms. And so at several moments this idea of toxic masculinity has come up. And what we see in our workshops is when you actually open up space for people and you say to them, listen, you can react. You could react defensively, but instead, let's have a look at actually what sort of community you want to live in and actually what sort of person you want to be. Very few of them want to live in a world where Me Too has to happen. And if you can give people that opportunity to actually grow as individuals and grow as a supportive group, to learn to listen and to learn to support change and to learn to actually be part of change, it can be a very powerful moment. I would say it's very difficult to translate what we do with 10 to 20 people, whether it's in a workplace or a university or a classroom or wherever. It's difficult to translate that very intense experience to the world of a hashtag. But people like Trump have succeeded in a way, but with a different approach. They've succeeded in put forward an idea that let's go back, let's build up these ramparts around our ideas about what men should be, and let's defend those. And I would say we do also have an opportunity, whether it's in small groups, in your own local communities, or if someone actually has a strong political way of doing this at a larger scale, to make more positive changes there and to really reinforce this opportunity, these spaces that have been opened up by Me Too, to make a change.
Jan, question for you, because you work both in schools, so with younger men, but you also go to work in workplaces, in offices.
Yeah.
So what sort of generational differences are you seeing, divides in the response?
Yeah. Young people, in general, are far more aware about gender. Yeah. As a term. They're not scared about talking about gender. It's been put into their lives. They're familiar with, somewhat familiar at least, that there is such a thing as a trans person, for instance. And that's not the case in most workplaces. And these things are a bit more rigid, and it feels more unsafe to have those conversations. And also, I think in those workplaces, far more of the structures that exist are tied to those gendered ways of behaving. And people are afraid of opening up and discussing in case they would overstep certain lines, get reprimanded. So those are the key differences there. You see the same defensiveness, you see those same initial reactions, but just that conversation to take action needs to be a bit longer, as there are more complicated power dynamics to overcome.
Thanks for that. Heidi, you look at social movements more broadly. I have to say that Shaista and I were at a Me Too event sponsored by Chatham House last year. And it was brought to our attention by one of the more experienced women in the audience that this was not actually the first time that women had to confront gender inequality, that there had been something called previous ways of feminism before. Because there was this sort of sense of, oh, eureka, I've discovered patriarchy, as if it hasn't existed for the last 7,000 years. So Heidi, I mean, it would be great if you could give us the long view on how this movement, hashtag #MeToo, fits into sort of previous waves of the fight for gender equality, but also to look at the context of hashtag #MeToo in the bigger sphere of other hashtag movements that have emerged over the past few years. And how do you keep the momentum to ensure that activism doesn't become slacktivism?
Oh. Well, I feel like I've just been given an essay question for my A-levels. Anyway, you know, the long arc of history is so exciting to analyze and to look at when we look at the Me Too, because women have campaigned in localities and globally for hundreds of years. And in fact, you know, you pointed out the fact that the Me Too movement, as we know it now, currently, was actually started by a black woman, an African-American woman called Tananya Burke, 10 years ago. So she started that hashtag. But my beef is that it's been taken over by relatively elite white women. So I think that there is a whole intersectional issue here at stake. The way that the Me Too has been co-opted or appropriated by a very privileged group of women and has focused largely on institutional and workplace discrimination. But if we look back at, in 1851, Sojourner Truth, do you know who Sojourner Truth is? Some of you will know. She was born in slavery in America, and she said the phrase, "Ain't I a woman?" And back then, she was saying exactly Me Too. It was the first Me Too moment that I could actually trace back. And she was saying, I'm black, but I'm also a woman. And even though, you know, women's rights in America at that time were being constructed around white women's rights to vote, and the black women weren't even seen as human. So in that sense, the Me Too movement has had this trajectory where black women and women of color are saying, me too. So it isn't just about sexuality, it's also about race and gender. And it's also about LGBTQI issues as well, where they're saying, me too. So everyone is saying, we need to be heard, and that it's time to be heard. But if we look back at the civil rights movement, for example, Rosa Parks was another Me Too movement. She got up and she said, you know, I deserve a place on this bus. And you all must know who Rosa Parks is. And she said that, and if we look at the civil rights movement, we think of Martin Luther King, but we don't actually see people like Rosa Parks, or we don't actually talk about Ella Barker, who started the voter registration drive. She was saying me too, and using grassroots women of color in order to put on the agenda the fact that gender-based violence is something that is not only in their own communities, and this is something that we have to be brave enough to talk about, because Toni Morrison, a black woman writer, African-American writer, you probably know her work. She said, you know, we have to stand up to the patriarchal abuses in our own communities, in black communities, in Muslim communities, and we can't be precious about it. And I know that this is a difficult issue, because Me Too cuts across race, gender, class, but in our communities, but also what happens in elite institutions. So I've been in universities for 40 years, and I say there hasn't been a day when some kind of gender-based violence has happened to me, or to a student, or that I don't have to deal with it. Because with impunity, the men in those institutions, and sometimes very privileged women, actually, you know,
Demean and belittle.
Demean and belittle you as a matter of course. You know, I've been locked in rooms, held by my neck. You know, I've been stalked, and you know, terrible things have been written about, you know, to me, like, can I squeeze your tits if you get this thing wrong, you know. I mean, just completely inane, embarrassing.
But it's the way in which, I mean, young women come to me now, because I've written about this stuff so much. Young women of all kinds, you know, in universities or wanting to become lawyers and so on. And they talk about the stuff that they have to deal with. And what saddens me is when older women sort of are dismissive of it and say, for heaven's sake, it's not, you know, we all had to deal with that, and we ran round tables, and we just had to, you know, make sure we were never in the lift alone with so-and-so and whatever. But why should it be that people have to deal with that all the time? Why should it be that you have to deal with people saying to you, you've got great tits, give us a feel? Yeah. Why should young women have to put up with this stuff all day, all the time? And now women are saying, we're not going to do it. And men have to, men have to step up and say, and call out bad behaviour from other men too. We should be in this together. It shouldn't just be seen as an issue for women.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the points you raised go to the heart of this as well. I mean, wherever I've worked my entire life, I've been subjected to overt racism, covert racism, Islamophobia, and then on top of that, my gender and the discrimination I face as a woman then kicks in as well. So there's multiple levels and layers of this discrimination. A couple of weeks ago, Alexia and I were at the LSE, where I was asked to come and talk about Me Too and Aid Too. And the professor there, she deliberately constructed a panel of women of colour. And she did this in a very subtle way, but it didn't go unnoticed, because women of colour usually are erased, especially black women. And anyway, what happened in that audience it was incredible. A young woman who wears a hijab stood up and she disclosed to the room about a sexual assault that took place on her. And afterwards, she came over to me and she said, I felt like I could talk about this because I saw a woman who looked like me talking about it. And when, I've said this earlier on, but you know, when people are not just given platforms or space, it's a very politicized decision by the gatekeepers and by people with power to allow certain individuals to speak. So what we have to do is, those of us who have the privilege of coming to speak on panels like this, our one job is to open up that space and make sure those people who are not represented in the room, who are not represented on panels, are given that space. That's the job that we have to do. Yeah. And honestly, I have lost count of the number of particularly women of colour and black women who have come over to me and wanted to talk to me about the fact that at the heart of the misogyny that they face and the sexual harassment they face is their race, because they are silenced by the fact that, you know, they don't get the same platforms, they don't get the same opportunities, they're not given the same privileges to speak. And when it comes to Muslim women in particular, the dehumanizing, particularly of Muslim women, working class Muslim women, is so mainstream in this country. You know, you are seen as a silent, subservient, oppressed a creature, not even a woman, or a figure of intrigue, or someone who's exotic. You are never allowed to be a 360-degree, you know, whole, you know, individual, a woman. And, you know, this has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, as you referenced as well. This is not new, but I think what's new now is that we have an opportunity to change things, and it starts with building solidarity and talking about things and not avoiding difficult conversations. That's where it starts.
Well, we're about to start that right now, so it's over to you. Thank you very much. Plenty of food for thought. It's now your turn at the table, please, so let's dig in. We're very keen to hear your questions and comments. Now, I'm told a roving microphone will make its way to you, so please raise your hand. I'm going to take questions in groups of about 3. If you could please give us your name and affiliation. And also, if your question is directed at a particular panelist, please let us know. And we have a lot of people in the audience, and we want to have a lot of conversation. So if you could keep your questions to the point, that would be much appreciated. OK, we have one gentleman at the back. We have, OK, we'll do one gentleman at the back. Is there another microphone? Up here, a lady in the front. Yeah, blonde lady there. Can you give her the microphone? OK, we just have 2 mics, is that correct? OK, we'll take 2 questions at a time. Please, at the back.
This is a question to Shaista Aziz.
Sorry, can you tell us who you are?
I'm Sammy.
OK, where do you come from, Sammy?
I come from school 621, which is a 6th form in Stratford.
Thanks.
And I just want to ask a question about, because as you're a Muslim and you wear the hijab and everything, and about gender equality, doesn't Islam give you the gender equality already, and it gives you the perfect equality that you need and have, and is it going to be like, is it going to affect you if, example, like we want to equalize men and women, but Islam prohibits some of those stuff? So, like, what can you do as, like, yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take that one as well. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, I'm Alexia. I work with Shaista, which is a pleasure. I have a question for you, Heidi, about your point about how we need to be very clear that Me Too is not a white feminist elitist movement. What could you tell us about history of how, as a white feminist and someone trying to be very aware of my own privilege I bring to my platforms, what can we do to learn from those historical damages that have been done in the name of trying to only progress certain women's rights?
Okay, we'll take another 2 questions while we're at it. We'll have gentleman at the back, and we'll have a lady at the front with wearing glasses.
Hello, my name's Kevin, and I go to...
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Sorry. Is it on? Oh, sorry. My name's Kevin, and I go to a school called Prendergast.
Okay.
And I have a question for Heidi, and is that Malcolm X once said that the most disrespected person in America is a black woman. And I want to know, what do you think, or how far has the Me Too movement done to promote equality for black women and create change?
I'll just say #boom, Kevin. Nice one. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joanna. I'm from Godalming College. I've got a question for Helena. You're talking about the state and that the state is letting down women. Is it the state that's letting down women, or is it society and the culture we have around feminism and around sexual discrimination? So can there be more laws that are actually going to enforce things? People are always going to break the law. But what can we do to stop them from wanting to do things culturally rather than legislation to stop that?
Great, thank you very much for this first round. So where shall we begin? Yeah, so Sammy, I think
Shaista about faith and
Shaista and I are going to both address this, as I'm also Muslim. So do you want to pick up on the women's side, and I'll talk about the men's side?
Go for it. No, go. Oh, me, okay. So, Sammy, thanks very much for that question. I think that was an excellent question. In terms of me and my faith, I'm very clear about my faith. My faith empowers me as a woman. What doesn't empower me is the male interpretation of my faith and cultural practices, which are very, very harmful towards women and often lead to women being killed in very violent and horrific ways. This happens across the board, by the way, around the world, regardless of whether someone has a faith or not. But as someone who's born into a Muslim family, I myself had to go out of my way to go and really engage with my faith. So what I'd say to anybody in this room who is a person of faith is you may be born into a faith, but it's down to us to actually critically analyze what our faith teaches us. It's not enough for us to just follow. Usually it's men who lead religious lead religions or mosques or churches or synagogues for that matter. And so it's up to us to question and evaluate what we've actually been taught, and to go out and seek truths. And the more we question and the more we seek information, I think it actually, for me, it made my faith stronger.
There's the famous hadith from the Prophet, peace be upon him, seek knowledge even unto China.
Yeah.
So we're encouraged to go and question.
Yeah, and women have played an absolutely pivotal role in Islam. They are frequently erased by men in particular, but also women. You know, there's a lot of women who are the gatekeepers of patriarchy as well, because it benefits them to keep other women down. So the basic, my response to your question really is that for me, I don't separate my faith from my feminism and from my activism and from my life. It's very much part of my life. And also, as a visible Muslim woman who is doing this work and has been doing this work for a long time, I find that I'm able to get into spaces and have conversations in ways that other people simply can't. I'm going to give you one really quick example, okay? I spent a lot of time working on the Afghan-Pakistan border when I was working as an aid worker, and I was able to interview women and get access to information and find out about their lives in ways that other, foreign, I'm an expat, inverted commas, aid workers simply couldn't. And what I found was that there was a lot of patriarchal practices and cultures that were being implemented by Western aid organizations in that area, which were also damaging women, because they were basically thinking they were being respectful to cultures. Now, when cultures are damaging and in some places, killing women or contributing to killing women, we can't be respectable about that. We have to call it out every single time. And it goes back to your point, Heidi, about kind of really critically analysing what's happening inside communities. And we have to do that, otherwise we're being hypocritical. So I hope that answers your question to an extent.
And I work with men and boys in the Middle East and North Africa, where my family comes from. And I think we also need to keep in mind that these very patriarchal interpretations of faith, which box in women and girls by imposing all these constraints and controls, they also box in men, because they create ideals of masculinity which belong to some sort of Sella fantasy period in the past, some alleged golden age of masculinity which never really existed, but is certainly unattainable today. So, as Shaista said, these constrictive, conservative interpretations of faith are not just shackling women and girls, they're also limiting men and boys. But for those who are interested, just in an Islamic context, there's a great group we work with. It's called Musawa, and it's Islamic feminists, both male and female activists and scholars, who are working to open up interpretations around Islam and gender. So very happy to give you details.
Can I add exposure to this?
Yeah.
Because it's not confined to Islam.
Yeah.
It's virtually every religion. I can't think of any religion where this isn't the case. You have to ask yourself always, and it's the question I ask about law, who made it in the first place? Who were the originators of some of these rules? And what you find is that most of the things that are inhibitors of women, that say that women's evidence isn't of the same value as men, which says all kinds of things, and Christianity is full of this stuff too, is that it usually is brought into existence by men of a certain era and then repeated and reinforced, and women swallow it too. And that happened in my faith. I was brought up as a Catholic, and so that's why my books are called Eve Was Framed and Eve Was Shamed, because the whole Eve myth, that Eve caused sin, is something that you have to think, who thought that one up? And so all I can tell you is this happens in all faiths, but it also happens in legal systems, because originally, of course, law has been manufactured by men, and although we're getting more women in the system and in parliaments, we've still essentially got man-made law.
I just want to add one really quick thing, just really quickly. That is, just very quickly, that is that I think what Me Too has done is expose this myth, especially to white Western women, that they had equality, that they had everything on lockdown, and it's basically true, but turned out not to be true.
Heidi, a couple of questions to you.
Well, I've got a couple of questions, but I just wanted to come in on the Muslim woman thing, because I'm from Trinidad in the Caribbean, and I was brought up in a Christian, environment. But when I went to university, I got married and converted to Islam. And it was just an incredible experience for me. It was my life-changing, maybe my Me Too moment. Because until that moment that I converted to Islam, I had no respect for myself. I was really, at a drop of a hat, I would go out with somebody, and heaven knows what else. I wouldn't even go into what I would do. I was wearing the skimpiest bikinis on the beach, and all that mattered to me was that I was an object of desire. I felt empowered through this being an object of desire. It made me feel good if I looked good, if somebody commented on me. And that's how I constructed my femininity. And I think this is the really important part, because when I converted to Islam, I wore modest clothes. I wore long dresses. I wore a headscarf. And I suddenly realized that I didn't need all those trappings of my so-called desirable femininity in order to be a woman. I could actually feel quite empowered through education, through knowledge, through understanding who I really was. So I didn't need the male gaze to reinforce me. I could find that within myself. So it comes to your point. In theory, Islam can give you those things, but I no longer practice in the same way, and I no longer, I'm not wearing my headscarf, and I don't. I'm pretty much not religious at the moment, but anyway, that's a whole other confessional thing that I'm not going to go into.
I like your variation on the hijab. The beret is an interesting innovation.
Actually, my hair needs washing, but anyway.
Heidi, in the interest of time, just if we could just address the questions about the white feminist movement, and also the.
But that leads me to the question on white feminism, because you see, the idea of gender equality has been very much constructed in a white woman's image, in the understanding of, gender equality, this idea of a level playing field, that we don't really change society, but we up the game so that we can get access to opportunities. So we have equal opportunities, we have equal pay legislation, we have a kind of we have policies and legal systems to give us those equalities. And what we find is that a lot of white women are in good positions. If you look at higher education,
go up the ladder often.
They go up the ladder, but they don't break through. Yeah. But we do find that the whole diversity industry at the moment, equality and diversity industry, is actually peopled by middle-class white women. We don't find black women being even getting those jobs anymore. So, there are industries and a sort of performativity around equality. So I think that, the experiences of black women and, Black Lives Matter, I didn't even go into this long arc of history, but Black Lives Matter was started up by black women as well, and queer women of color. And I think this is where the future lies for us very much, in queering our society. And by that I mean that we really deconstruct those fundamental ideas of what it is to be binary, male and female. That's where a kind of future lies for us to rethink things, which leads. I mean, there's another question on.
There was Malcolm X.
The most disrespected people in America are women, black women.
Yes, and they still are. Kimberly Crenshaw, the theorist who invoked intersectionality, though intersectionality has been a very long time, she has started up the hashtag Say Her Name in response to Black Lives Matter, because she says when Black Lives Matter took off, not only was it taken over and the queer women of color were pushed to one side, but black women's lives weren't being brought to the fore. It was black men in prison and in relation to state police violence. But there was this whole area of which black women are violated and by men in their own community, disappear, and gender-based violence is actually endemic. So it's absolutely right that, you know, black women are still at the bottom of the pile.
Yeah. I mean, sitting here as a white man in this conversation and as part of a gender organisation, I can say actually how difficult it has been to recognise and break through the barriers that we've put in place as our organisation to actually recruit people from various backgrounds, and how blind that we can be that some of the things we weren't, obviously we think through this a lot, but we couldn't recognise that some of the ways we structured our recruitment policies just made it very, very difficult for, well, particularly people of particular classes to come and join the organisation. You can't get time off to take a day and learn how to volunteer, etc. So it's not always just about, you often have to reflect a bit more deeply about the multiple barriers that you've put up, your biases, the structural things you put in place, the things you've just absorbed as taken for granted practices that just really shouldn't be. Anyway, I thought I'd jump in there.
I've got the question to answer from the young woman.
Yeah.
And I just want to add to Joanna's excellent point about the relationship between law and the state and society.
Yeah.
But to also look at the, I mean, we've had some really disturbing developments on the legal front. I mean, I don't know if you saw the news over the weekend that the case against Harvey Weinstein is losing, some of the wheels are coming off of it. And there were some serious questions about the limitations of the criminal legal process in actually addressing these questions. And is there space for a restorative justice approach? Would that be a better way of dealing with these issues?
Well, let me just go to Joanna's question. It's absolutely right that we've got to make a distinction between the state, what governments and parliaments do in the name of creating rules for us all to live with each other, and things that are social norms and changing attitudes within society. And in my recent book, I've really said, I've spent my life trying to tweak the law, get legal reform, no cross-examination on sexual history. It has to be very limited. I've tried to do stuff on the whole business of corroboration that it shouldn't be necessary if a witness is believable and so forth. So we've tried reforming law and it doesn't deliver. And reforming law of itself will not do the business, and that's what we're seeing with the Weinstein thing. Is because we set up these rules to deal with situations which are very difficult when the underpinning attitudes which have informed the nature of law have been discriminatory. So that in many ways what my work has been about has been looking at the ways in which black letter law itself, without even realizing it, has presented as neutral things that are not neutral, and which will inevitably disadvantage certain sections of our society. And there are those who have not had power in the naming of law. There was a great philosopher, John Rawls, who said, if you're going to be making law, let's imagine a veil of ignorance, and that you're behind the veil of ignorance and you don't know whether you're a man, a woman, whether you're gay or straight, whether you're disabled or able-bodied, and that you then make law which wasn't going to discriminate against any of those people. But of course, we all are people, we don't come to making law in that way because we bring our own baggage. And the people who are making decisions, judges and so forth, that's why the case of who was going to be on the Supreme Court of America was so important, because people bring their baggage, their attitudes, their social norms to the process of judgment. And so that's what is my source of depression at the moment, is we make law, but in delivering it, we try to pretend that it's neutral, but it isn't. And we have to look at how do we change social norms and attitudes in society, and how do we make demands of our police, our prosecutors, our defense lawyers, our judges, to say, you've got a responsibility to actually be more conscious of the ways in which you might be biased than anybody else, because yours is the business of justice, which is so fundamental in any decent society. So yeah, the interplay between society and changing society, vitally important, but also the role of law is vital also in societies. These are the rules. And if it fails, then people feel, what's the point? It's why people are saying Black Lives Matter. You know, you can shoot people in the street, and that's your way of delivering justice. You know, where's the justice for us? And so people are saying this in different sections of our societies. They're saying, where's the justice for us?
So just picking up the point about the conversations that are being had about the sort of restorative justice approach, that almost a truth and reconciliation rather than a more adversarial criminal approach. What do you say to that?
The whole idea of restorative justice started really often in countries where there were indigenous communities saying, this isn't how we resolve problems in our communities. It was always about bringing the two parties that were angry with each other or had some righteous feeling that they had been maligned or abused or their property stolen or their physical being disturbed, and we would try and find a way of resolving it that isn't as weighed down with some of the kind of notions that you have in Western societies. And so it started in New Zealand and Australia and so on, this business of trying to find ways of bringing people together. I think you can do that with less serious levels of crime and abuse. I do not think you can do that when it comes to somebody who's been serially abused, you know, a child who's been abused over years, or a person who has been violently raped, or just the whole business of feeling that you have been used physically against your will. That is of such seriousness that I do not think that you can find those kind of easy ways. There needs the formality of a process and due process in order to reach conclusions. However, I'm not sure that just throwing away the key and locking people up is the answer. And I therefore do think that we have to be working with some of this stuff. And I certainly think that when it comes to the business of people, you know, wrongdoing of a lesser seriousness, but which is still an encroachment on people's freedom, that you have to, you can find ways in the workplace to actually deal with some of that stuff, which isn't about automatically having to sack people or, you know, destroy people's lives, you know, when they're students or whatever, because they behave badly. I do believe in redemption. I do believe there is a way forward, and I think that we have to find them.
Yeah, might I just jump into that moment as well, because it's the other aspect of this is the prevention side of things as opposed to the justice side of things. And just thinking about how impotent the law can be to actually shift people's attitudes, that it does tend to confront people as being potential perpetrators, and very few people can actually imagine themselves before they've done something as being a potential perpetrator. Whereas if you can actually shift the general attitude and way that people see themselves in relation to other people in their school, their university, their workplace, society in general, those can be more profound shifts, which need to come on top of the law.
But you see, I'm a lawyer, and never, it's not going to surprise you when I say I believe in what we call due process. I don't like the idea. I mean, I don't think that you get justice for women by reducing justice for men. You know, it's just that would be crazy. And so lots of young feminists come to me, black and white, and from the Muslim backgrounds, whatever. I've acted for women and men across all the divides. And but women will come to me and say, why don't we just make the standard of proof lower so we can get more convictions? And I have to say, hold on a minute. Once you start doing that here, then it starts traveling. There's a terrible way in which governments think, oh, that was a good idea, and then they start taking it elsewhere. If we're going to punish people, there have to be high standards. So you don't go down that road. Reducing justice for men in order to get more justice for women is a folly. But what we have to do is find fair and just ways of dealing with this stuff. And I certainly believe that prevention is the best way possible. And I don't think that imprisonment is always the best answer either. So I just think that we have to be much more creative and also kinder to each other and find kinder methods for dealing with some of this stuff. But there comes a moment where the only right process is law. And it has to be just law. And it has to be done in a proper way where we don't deal with people unfairly. And that is hard.
Right, another round of questions, please. Gentleman here in the back row. Oh, wow, okay. The floodgates have opened. Lady in the front, here. I didn't mean I said the floodgates were open. I meant for questions, not for you to leave. Okay, microphone to the gentleman there, and here in the front. Lady in the front here.
Thank you. As an old, white, heterosexual man, I feel at a singular disadvantage here.
And your name, sorry, and your name
My
is?
name's Don Grocott, and I'm a member at Chatham House. Okay. The question I really wanted to ask is, do you think that the Me Too movement will be more effective if it didn't find more enemies? I've sat in this audience and discovered that men are represented by some silly person in the audience at Helena Kennedy's recent meeting, or by that chap who's currently the President of the United States. Men aren't represented by either of those two people. And equally, I was slightly surprised to discover that elite white women who happen to have put Me Too really on the map are also an enemy. Do you think there's another way of looking at this, which would be, Helena, if I may use your words, kinder and more inclusive?
Okay, so we'll come to the kinder and gentler approach. The lady here in the front, hi.
My name is Samantha, and I go to All Saints Catholic School.
Hi.
And my question is, I know you've heard of FGM, and if you don't know what FGM is basically female circumcision. So it makes it really hard or almost impossible for a female to have sex, and it's usually in like Africa, but now it's like in the US and even in here. So why do you think females are like, they have pain put on them for no reason from the age of 0 to 15 when men are the ones who are sexually abusing them, so on and so forth?
Okay, thanks for that. We had, far gentleman on the aisle in the back, and okay, and then woman over here in the front. Where's the second mic? Yep, great. Keep your hand up, please. Okay. Right. Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arne, and I'm also from the same sixth form my Sam comes from, which is 621 in Stratford. I have a question for Daniel. I see that you are the director of the Good Lad Initiative, and the connotation I got from that is that that's not the most formal way to call an initiative. So my question to you is, do you believe that it takes more of an informal, colloquialized approach to bring the best out of young people, or does it take more of the formal, social, normal approach to get what you want from a young pupil's perspective? Because obviously, with the equal gender relations, it's quite a sensitive topic for young people. So what do you believe is the best approach to get the best out of young people?
Okay, and the lady.
Me.
Hi.
Great. Hi. Hi, I'm Karis. I'm from SRM. So my question is more of a sort of foreign policy kind of aspect. You've been mentioning the personal is political quite a lot, or you mentioned it at the start. And obviously, like, feminist international relations researchers have been talking it for years and years and years. Do you think that Me Too, in the way it's kind of come to the surface, could act as a catalyst to kind of put individual experiences on the map when it comes to state-level politics or global politics?
Okay, great, thanks for that. All right, so let's tackle the kinder, gentler #MeToo. Who wants to take that one on? Is there another way?
Well, I definitely believe that people being kinder and gentler to each other, but also believe in accountability, and that's where it starts from. So we should be kinder and gentler, full stop, throughout the whole process, but we also need to confront ourselves about the realities that have never been confronted. So you use the word inequality at the beginning of our panel discussion, and that's fundamentally at the heart of this, is inequality. And until there is accountability for perpetrators' actions, we will never be able to move forward. So I do believe that, as you said, there are restorative justice initiatives and all the rest of it, which do need to be looked into. But this can only happen when, in particular, male perpetrators actually take responsibility for what they have done and show some remorse. and it's still not happening. I mean, earlier on someone talked about, you know, men being sacked. Not enough men have been sacked, frankly. Men are still in those positions of power, and they always will be. And there's very little has changed in terms of men being held accountable in relation to the Me Too movement. Let's not, I mean, we've mentioned Donald Trump already, but this man was elected despite a long catalogue of accusations against him, very serious accusations made against him. Despite all of this being published in the New York Times and elsewhere, he was still elected. And we must also remember that 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump. And the reason why I raise this is because at the heart of this is people's interests. So rather than, you know, for those white women, it was more important to vote for Donald Trump than it was to, like, you know, not push the sisterhood under the bus. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
I just want to say to our gentleman friend who just raised that question, I want to remind people, 2 women a week are killed by their spouse or partner. Every minute that we're sitting here, every minute a call is being made to the police about domestic violence. Every minute a woman is being raped, because that's the statistics in this country around crime. We are seeing very, very poor attrition rates in terms of cases being brought through the courts in terms of rape. And these women are not making it up. And so, I mean, you know, there might occasionally be a false accusation, but they're very small in number. And so I just want you to think that this is not about we've had to rake around to find some bad man, and we find Donald Trump or as a man in an audience. No, no, no. Well, you pointed out only 2 men have been mentioned. I'm just telling you that many, many men do feel a sense of entitlement. They do feel that a fuss is being made about nothing, and that's not good enough. And we really need men like you to be standing up and being supportive of getting something changed in our society. When I told the story about the man in the audience saying, in all this equality, what's going to happen to us? The reason that it's an interesting example is because of, underneath it all, he was saying something that was very important. He was saying, it feels like loss to us. Because if there's going to be equality in all the workplaces, and women are going to be getting as many jobs on the judiciary as men, or women are going to be getting as many senior executive jobs, or women are going to get promoted as much as men, then an awful lot of men are not going to get those jobs. And so it does mean that something has to happen in the recalibration inside our society. I would like to see better pay for caring jobs, the people who do caring of the elderly, caring of children, caring of the people with disabilities. If it were properly paid, more men would be willing to do it and not see it as women's work. And so we have to rethink the way our society works. And so, you know, it's very painful for men who've seen deindustrialization and the jobs that they used to do which were theirs, and their sense of pride that came in it, and they're feeling undermined and threatened by all of this. And so this is not about being unkind to men. It's about saying, this is a reality. I'm married to a terrific man, and I adore him. I've got 2 great sons. But everybody knows that at times, there are times when you overstep the line. If men are on the back foot, I think it's a good thing. It means they're having to think about what it is that they might do that might in some way make a woman feel diminished or lesser. And that's good that we think about that. But we should also, as privileged women, be thinking about the ways in which we do it to men and to younger people and to younger women. And sometimes older women can be terrible to younger women and to women of colour. And so I just want us to all think about how we behave. And when I talk about being kinder, I'm talking about the way in which we all behave to each other. And at the moment, our society, I think, is becoming a very brittle, hard place. And one of the reasons why is we've been living with an economic system that has been saying, get yours, look after number one, look after yourself, and forget other people. And in fact, that sense of responsibility to each other has been diminished. We have to be responsible for each other, and that's about working towards a more equal society. So come and join us.
I'm going to very quickly pick up on the point about FGM, because I actually come from Egypt, where 97% of women aged 15 to 49 have been circumcised. So it's a very complex area, but the bottom line is that women are often circumcised because it's thought to control their sexual urges, because actually men feel that somehow they're going not to be able the women's sexual desire will be untrammeled, and therefore men will not be able to satisfy them. There'll be confusion in society. There are many other reasons. It's a very complex subject, but what's really interesting is there's been so much research in countries where FGM, female circumcision, is prevalent, looking at why women and girls, the decision-making there. It's only now starting to talk to men and boys about their attitudes. And in the research I've done on FGM in Egypt, a lot of men actually have no clue whether women are circumcised or not, because they have a very sketchy knowledge of female anatomy down there. But aside from, which is probably actually almost a universal finding, but also the fact that when it's pointed out that it not just, it diminishes her sexual pleasure and therefore is going to have a knock-on effect on his sexual pleasure, well then the attitudes start changing. But very happy to discuss this in greater detail, and the session is over. We're running out of time, so very quickly over to you, Dan, on the Good Lad Initiative question, which methods, formal versus informal?
Yeah, and I think it does pick up on this point about many men feeling like they don't have a place in this. And I mean, the encouragement is that there are many, many things that people can change in their workplaces and their family life that would make a huge contribution, that men could change, that make a huge contribution to this. And I think as a way of approach, some of those conversations, as we've seen today, are painful. Like a lot of stuff is getting brought up that's like really quite heavy, hard, difficult issues. And it's really important to create a space, firstly, that feels safe and respectful, and secondly, that's informal enough that people can say things, can put out ideas, and fail, and say things that they then might in other contexts regret, that they can experiment with these new ideas, that they can experiment with this new way of gender relations, and when they do fail, actually learn from those mistakes. And for that reason, almost exclusively, we use very informal sorts of spaces, facilitated by people who are trained at actually making others feel comfortable at thinking about themselves, thinking about their social norms, thinking about the broader context of societies that they live in. Yeah. Thanks for that,
Dan. Heidi, do you want to weigh in on any of these points?
God, on every single one of the questions. But anyway, I just wanted to say, there's this amazing quote by Audre Lorde, who is a black feminist writer and theorist. She's now passed, but and she says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think that, just in a quick summing up of everything, the laws, the social norms, the religion and the faith and everything, they're all the master's tools. And we live in that world. And the way in which we can navigate it is actually to build our capacity through education. And that's why I'm a great advocate for that, because the World Economic Forum met just a month or so ago, and the gap is growing. The gender gap is growing, the poverty gaps are growing, inequalities are increasing. And this is so frightening, yet we have some of the most progressive legislation for equalities in this country and globally. We have the UN, we have all these organizations that are meant to look after women's well-being. And it's not happening. There is something very big afoot. And it's because the master's tools are flawed, and they benefit. If you look at the moment at this non-disclosure agreement of Philip Green.
The NDAs, the non-disclosure agreements where you gag people so that they can't speak about the ways in which they've been raped or abused by powerful men.
Yes, and things like that. So a powerful person with very good lawyers can access a non-disclosure agreement and protect himself from his heinous crimes. So we have the law, but we cannot access the law. And there is a very great social theorist called Amartya Sen, an Indian theorist, and he says, we can we can have all these amazing laws and policies and so on, but if we can't access it, so you can build a school in a rural area, but if you can't get to the school because it's too far, or you have to go and collect water in the morning, so you cannot go there, what's the point in having it? So we have to have access. And one of the things that the government brought in is actually to have a tribunal against sexual harassment or any kind of bullying. You now have to put money up front, well over a few £1,000s to even get in to have a tribunal. Who can do that if you're poor?
Given that this is Chatham House, and I'm going to pick up on Sarah's question about foreign policy and how #MeToo and these feminist considerations are working their way in and how to best reflect that. Just to bear in mind, of course, that we have seen the introduction of feminist foreign policies explicitly such in Sweden, and Canada, of course, has its own feminist international assistance policy. But over to Shaista, who actually looks at this very closely, about how #MeToo may have opened that space.
Well, I definitely think it's opened up more space, as I've said throughout, my contributions to the panel. But I think we have to be careful because feminism has become fashionable. It's selling handbags and T-shirts and all sorts of things. It's been commodified. Yeah. That's not going to get us anywhere. We have to drill down and get back to the basics of it, right? And I think that's definitely happening as well. As we know, Sweden is the country that is the world's first country to implement a feminist foreign policy. By no means is it perfect, but it's there and it's a model that's being. The Canadians are looking into it. The Labour Party here in the UK is looking into it. So I think it's seeping through. But I think the other thing is it's kind of shining a very important spotlight on who governments work with, who is given access to the table, who is allowed into that space again. There you go. And that point that I keep raising over and over again. And I think that's really vital, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I saw something on Facebook about a reconstruction conference for Syria. I mean, people are still being killed in Syria. Bombs are still being dropped on Syria. And here are people talking about reconstruction. It's beyond words, So I think our job is to hold this power to account, and it is to, as I said, start showing open, active solidarity with each other and understanding the links between all of these issues. They're all interlinked. Everything is interlinked, and I think that's what the feminist foreign policy is trying to do. We are a fair distance away from having it implemented properly, but we're getting there, and we just have to keep pushing for it.
Well, I'm sure we could say the same of our entire discussion, because we've started a conversation which could go on for the rest of the day and then some. But unfortunately, we have to call this session to a close. So I want to thank our speakers, Dan, Heidi, Helena, Shaista. And thanks to all of you for your insightful questions and comments. As I said, the formal session ends now, but we're going to be here for a while, so let us continue the conversation. Thank you very much.